Hello everyone and welcome back to History in Games. Today we're going to talk about Ghost of Tsushima Iki Island and how this expansion might tie into real history. By the way, if you haven't already played Ghost of Tsushima, please do so. It's a fantastic game. Now, we don't know a ton about the story for Iki Island so far, but according to the announcement trailer and developer interviews, we do know that during or after the events of Ghost of Tsushima, a female Khan and shaman known as the Eagle has taken over the Japanese island of Iki. This gravely concerns Sakai Jin, the game's hero, and his allies because it means the Mongol invasion of Japan isn't over. Thus, Jin travels to Iki, or rather, travels back to Iki, in order to liberate the island. You see, it turns out that Iki hides a very dark secret about Jin's family. What is it? Well, we'll have to play and see. But why did Sucker Punch decide to use Iki, a real island near Tsushima, as a backdrop for their new story? Well, it's probably because this island has a fascinating, if tragic, real-life history that ties into the Mongol invasions of Japan, and this history could easily be woven into Jin's story. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But don't worry, there are no major story spoilers for the game. And if you haven't already done so, check out my first video on the real-life history of Ghost of Tsushima to better understand the Mongolian invasions of 1274 and 1281. So in the original Ghost of Tsushima, the player helps Jin stop the army of Kublai Khan from conquering his home island. But in reality, Kublai's forces absolutely crushed the vastly outnumbered samurai defending Tsushima. Then after securing the island, the invaders sailed on to Iki. And this is where history takes a very dark turn. The defense of Iki Island had been delegated to a man named Taira Kagetaka, a proud samurai and military governor who may have been related to the famous Taira clan, which lost the Genpei War a century earlier, as recorded in the Tale of the Heike. When the Mongols arrived on the northwestern shores of Iki on November 13, 1274, the military governor immediately dispatched a message begging the main samurai contingent gathered at Hakata Bay on the nearby island of Kyushu to send reinforcements. In the meantime, Kagetaka had non-combatants take refuge in his castle called Hinotsume and led a small force of around 100 samurai to try and stop the invaders. Unfortunately, Kagetaka and his troops were horribly outnumbered. Thus, the Japanese suffered heavy casualties and were forced to retreat. The Mongols returned to their ships for a quick rest, but by morning, they had surrounded Hinotsume Castle in order to lay siege to it. Now, keep in mind this castle wasn't like the impressive stone fortresses built hundreds of years later during the Warring States period. This circular structure, surrounded by a moat, was likely made of earth and wood, so it's not too surprising the Mongols managed to breach one of the castle gates before being thrown back by the desperate samurai who were fighting for all they were worth. But when an enemy arrow caused a fire to break out inside the castle, things started to look grim. Realizing that no reinforcements from Kyushu were coming, and resigned to his fate, Kagetaka decided to open the gates of the fortress and lead one last charge against the enemy. But the Taira leader was not prepared for what he saw next. In a cold-blooded tactic known as Karash, which translates to living boards, the Mongols had rounded up any natives not behind the protective walls of Kagetaka's castle and were now using them as human shields against Japanese arrows. Unwilling to kill his own people, Kagetaka had his warriors drop their bows and arrows and instead charge into the enemy ranks with their swords. It was an incredibly daring decision, one that scuttled the Mongols' tactics. But alas, this didn't work for very long. The enemy numbers were simply too overwhelming. Realizing the battle was well and truly over, Kagetaka had the last of his retainers follow him back into the castle. Once inside, he ordered a servant to secretly escort his daughter, Katsurahime, off the island so she could warn the samurai of Kyushu about the Mongols' imminent success. Sadly, she never made it. While on her way to Kyushu, she was pierced by an enemy arrow and died. It was thus up to Kagetaka's loyal servant, a man named Sozaburo, to relay the warning to the samurai at Hakata Bay, which he managed to do. Not knowing his daughter's sad fate, Kagetaka and the rest of his family, as well as his loyal retainers, simultaneously committed ritual suicide as Hinotsume burned down around them. The Battle of Iki was over, but the horrors for its few Japanese survivors had only just begun. For example, the women of Iki were rounded up and their hands pierced by daggers so that a rope could be run through the holes. The women were then stripped naked and strung up on the side of the enemy's ships, like a gruesome human necklace. This may sound like an outrageous story, but there is mention of a similar punishment meted out by a 5th century Korean king in the Nihon Shoki. In the story, a suspected traitor to the kingdom of Paekje was bound up with a leather cord passed through holes in his palms before being executed and his head pickled. So it's possible this was a real punishment. The gruesome fate of the islanders of Iki most likely traveled all the way to the shogunate in Kamakura, and may be the reason why the outraged regent Hojo Tokimune refused any quarter or negotiations with the Mongols during their invasions of 1274 and 1281, and his determination to fight paid off. The Japanese samurai, helped by a couple of typhoons, managed to throw back the Mongol invaders. And on a side note, after the Meiji Restoration, Taira Kagetaka's heroic last stand was officially recognized by the government, and he was deified in Shinjo Jinja, a Shinto shrine that you can still visit on the island of Iki today. Now, it's not clear how or even if these real-life events will play out in Ghost of Tsushima. Will Taira Kagetaka be in the game? Will his daughter? Will we have to defend his castle? Is Hitsunome Castle the headquarters of the Eagle? Possibly. And it's possible the Eagle uses the same brutal tactics as the real Mongols to get what she wants, which would motivate Jin even more to rid Iki of her. On the other hand, perhaps the Eagle shuns these tactics and warns Jin that if he doesn't cooperate with her and come to some sort of peaceful resolution, some other Khan will come along and do all sorts of unspeakable things to the denizens of the island. We'll have to play the game to know for sure, but it will be interesting to see if any historical figures or events make it into this expansion. What do you think of Iki Island? Are you excited for more skills, more story, and more areas to explore? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoy history and games, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/meghanrsullivan. Thanks so much for watching, guys. See you later!